Welcome to the Republican Professor. I'm your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. Today is 24 March, 2026, years after Jesus. It's a Tuesday. Welcome back. We're back in the age of entitlement, doing a fair use and transformative reading of this book by Christopher Caldwell, published by Simon and Schuster in New York City. We're finishing the chapter on sex today. And no, there are no pictures. I know that's what most of you are wondering. There's a lot of good writing, though. Chris Caldwell is one of my favorite writers on American politics. We covered the chapter on race already, and we have covered most of the chapter on sex. And so we're finishing the last bit here in this chapter. And I believe that we are getting into the section on Roe versus Wade this time, which is a very important section. And I highly recommend that you get this book, follow along, get a physical copy of Christopher Caldwell's The Age of Entitlement. So what we're going to do is enjoy this. We covered last time on 5 February 2026, the feminine mystique and male sexism on page 42, going to top of page 46, Playboy and male sexuality. Then we kept going. We discussed Gloria Steinem, capitalism and class subsection on the bottom page 50. And then we stopped at the top of page 53, up to Roe versus Wade in the Supreme Court, but not including it. We're going to get there today. Roe versus Wade and the Supreme Court. Then we have Our Bodies, Ourselves on the bottom of page 57 today. And we have page 62, the Equal Rights Amendment, getting into page 65. Page 65 is the end of the chapter, and the next chapter is called War. Wow. I mean, this is all such fresh material, and so we want to thank Christopher Caldwell for helping us with this. It's very thought-provoking. Think about what he's saying. Do yourself a favor. And like I said, get a physical copy of The Age of Entitlement, America Since the 60s, Christopher Caldwell, Simon and Schuster, and follow along. Make notes. I see this pencil. I make notes with pencil in the margin. I make little check marks. I underline. I write dates that I read it, so on and so forth. The cost benefit calculation that had traditionally governed choices about love and destiny was shifting. In the early 20th century, an unwanted pregnancy generally meant a woman would get stuck in a cramped village existence with the first man she fell in love with, which is probably what would have happened anyway. For more and more people by 1973, that was decidedly not what would have happened anyway. One risked missing out on an expanded roster of life choices involving education, travel, career advancement, class advancement, and sex. We're on page 53. But especially education. More and more, when I see that term, I put quotations around it. Between 1973, Christopher Caldwell continues, and the turn of the century, real income rose by 21% for Americans with advanced degrees and fell for everyone else by 4% for college grads, 26% for high school grads, 38% for dropouts. Now, getting stuck in a relationship due to an accident could mean the difference between an exciting life spent adventurously climbing the social ladder and bottom rung drudgery, setting the stage for abortion. The Supreme Court made abortion legal in 1973 with its 7-2 ruling in Roe versus Wade. I think a better way to say that would be made abortion legal in all 50 states, which prior to that had different policies on abortion, created a national standard on abortion. The justices must have assumed that the future course of thinking on matters of reproductive rights was easy to discern. They were wrong. Roe is the most politically divisive Supreme Court decision in 116 years. Half a century later, its ultimate consequences are not yet clear. By the way, what was the 116 years prior? What was the decision that he had in mind that was most politically divisive? Anybody? Write it in the comments if you know. There's a wonderful book about it by Justin Buckley Dyer, which guess what? We're going to cover on the podcast. Yes, it's time. Slavery and abortion. That decision he was referencing was Dred Scott. And yes, there are some very interesting similarities. There's an analogy between slavery and abortion. We're going to get to it. Half a century later, its ultimate consequences are not yet clear. Talking about Roe versus Wade now. The polarization that faced Americans in the second decade of the 21st century had many causes. Most were long developing economic and social shifts. Roe was an exception. The decision was sloppily argued. Yes, it was. John Hart Ely. Check it out. The Wages of Crying Wolf, 1973, Yale Law Journal. That's me. Christopher Caldwell continues, it rested on a nonce right to privacy, established in Griswold versus Connecticut. That was 1965. That was only ever invoked for the ulterior purpose of defending abortion. In the countless important privacy cases that have come before the court in the half century since, page 54 at the top, covering everything from internet surveillance of terrorists to GPS tracking of automobiles, the Griswold Roe privacy right never came up. That's very insightful. That's very insightful, Caldwell. Yeah, very good. Very good. Very good. All the Fourth Amendment stuff. Where's the privacy stuff in that? Yeah, where is that? Where's Griswold? Not there. Not there. Shows you it was just about abortion. That's all it was. Brown versus Board of Education may not have been a forensic masterpiece either. And in the line of civil rights cases from Katzenbach to Bakke, didn't exactly shine for its constitutional logic. That's true. That's very true. See Edmund Kahn, Jurisprudence, 1955. What was it? New York Law Journal? New York University Law Journal. But powerful political pressures were then bearing down on Americans regarding their historical responsibility for slavery, and these were enough to override majority misgivings. Roe was different. It pronounced on an issue on which Americans were divided and froze those divisions in place. It laid down a fundamental moral and even religious order on a fickle and frivolous basis. Amen, brother. He is preaching. He is preaching, 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 preaching. Yes, this is so good. Brown versus Board of Education may have not been a forensic masterpiece either, and the line of civil rights cases from Katzenbach to Bakke didn't exactly shine for its constitutional logic, but powerful political pressures were then bearing down on Americans regarding their historical responsibility for slavery, and these were enough to override majority misgivings. Roe was different. Now, there did indeed seem to be a growing acceptance of abortion at the time of Roe, but it had no consistent political or ethical rationale. In 1967, three states had passed laws allowing abortion in the case of permanent threat to the mother's health. Two were heavily Republican, Colorado and California, where the new governor, Ronald Reagan, signed the furthest reaching liberalization of abortion in American history. You notice that that same year he also signed the Mulford Act, which prohibited, which regulated criminalized innocent contact related to the Second Amendment. And my theory on this, I've covered this on the podcast. I'm doing Baird versus Bonta. We covered this. Was that Reagan was a convert from the Democratic Party. He was still in his toddler years in terms of some of his grasp on these issues. He was acting like a Democrat. He hadn't become a Republican all the way. He was growing, but he needed more growth. Now, but North Carolina, which had voted Democratic in the last 9 presidential elections, passed similar laws. A presidential task force urged the repeal of abortion laws in 1968. New York, where Republicans controlled the governorship and both state chambers, legalized abortion in 1970. Its legislature voted 2 years later to repeal the law, though the repeal was vetoed by Republican Governor Nelson Rockefeller. Notably, there was also a belt of conservative Democratic states. What do you mean by conservative? With brand new laws permitting abortion under certain circumstances. They were all in the newly desegregated South, that is the Democrat South. In the 1960s, every coastal southern state from Alabama to Virginia legislated some kind of right to abortion, starting with a Mississippi law permitting abortion in the case of rape. By the time of Roe, half the states with at least some abortion rights were south of the Mason-Dixon line. The upshot of Roe, we're on bottom page 54, and an interlocking case, Doe versus Bolton, announced on the same day. And by the way, you should probably read both of those decisions together. Now, you can't read them at the same time because no one can read two things at the same time, but you should read them one after another together. Keep them in your mind. Doe versus Bolton was an unlimited right to abortion at any stage in the 9 months of pregnancy. Very good. Very good. A lot of people miss that. A lot of people they only talk about what Roe said, or they only think about what Roe said in terms of the holding, but Doe and Roe together, same day, together made that law. That's true. An unlimited right to abortion at any stage in the 9 months of pregnancy for decades until an uprising against so-called partial birth abortion in the 1990s, page 55 at the top. The United States would, alone among major industrialized countries, have no abortion laws, only Roe's ramshackle mandate. Ramshackle mandate. Well, shamshackle's not too bad either. Whether they thought the winds of history were blowing abortion rights, a majority of Americans opposed this blanket deregulation. We can tell because they were evenly split on the question of the least controversial abortions, those in the first months of pregnancy. And the last poll Gallup took before Roe versus Wade in 1972, 46% said they prefer, they favor a law permitting abortions during the first 3 months. 45% said they opposed it. Polls taken in the days after Roe versus Wade show that Americans had a sense that abortion was bad, but lacked a moral framework. Jeez, this is scary. Lacked a moral framework that would allow them to think about abortion logically and confidently. Yeah, this created a cottage industry here in terms of apologetics. Yeah. Well, you could say the same thing about the slavery issue. Apparently, people lacked a moral framework that allowed them to think about slavery logically and confidently, meaning correctly. They were concerned, Caldwell continues, about dangers to a mother's health, for which they favored allowing abortion by 91 to 8%. Rape, they favored abortion by 81 to 10%. And birth defects, abortion was okay by 82 to 15%. They wanted, it seemed, to guard against, quote, risk, unquote. But they understood that doing so could easily upset the rules of courtship, the balance of power between men and women, and what used to be called, quote, the way of the world, unquote. They were divided on how to proceed. Suppose a married woman who doesn't want more children gets pregnant. Tough luck. People disapproved of abortion in that case, 51 to 46%. And a young woman who gets knocked up by her boyfriend, tough luck to her too. 49% disapproved of abortion in that case versus 47% who approved. The hope that traditional sexual morality could survive in the introduction and destigmatization of abortion was a vain one. Abortion brought changes in morality because it suppressed certain basic anthropological conditions. Female adultery had throughout history been a more serious trespass than male adultery, not because of any irrational sexism, but out of a rational instinct for survival. When when a man strays, Caldwell says, he risks placing a child in some other household. When a woman strays, she risks introducing a creature with ulterior allegiances into the heart of her own. Page 56 at the top. Such straying was the cause of a good deal of anguish and murder, and many of the best novels in the European tradition. But where contraception had reduced the incidence of such problems, abortion outright solved them. Quote unquote, solved them. There need never be any progeny from an adultery. A certain reign on sexuality, particularly female sexuality, was snapped. In that, okay, so that in turn meant a new kind of society, one that would generate irresistible demands for further sexual freedoms. Just as Americans were getting comfortable with the things feminism had meant to Betty Friedan and her followers, liberation from household drudgery and loneliness, a fair shake in the workplace, equal dignity elsewhere. Feminism began showing signs of what it would blossom into a half century later: gender studies, queer theory, a questioning of all rules about sex. In the wake of Roe, the magazine Christianity Today editorialized, quote, Christians should accustom themselves to the thought that the American state no longer supports in any meaningful sense the laws of God and prepare themselves spiritually for the prospect that it may one day formally repudiate them and turn against those who seek to live by them. Unquote. That's a good quote. Page 56. Again, we're discussing The Age of Entitlement, America Since the 60s by Christopher Caldwell. New York, Simon & Schuster, 2020. Go out and get your copy today. Get a pencil, write notes, follow along. Roe. Okay, so there would soon be hundreds of thousands of abortions a year. Many Americans were content to live with the legal void in which they occurred, but some were not. And that meant that everybody now had a dangerous constitutional problem. Roe lacked the authority that had protected civil rights legislation from challenge. It was only a legal opinion and not a sturdy one, full of arguments that made it vulnerable to reconsideration and overturning. Those who found abortion repugnant naturally deplored Roe, but so did those who felt like that legal abortion was an indispensable component of modern freedom and who assumed that as such it deserved firmer protection than, say, the say-so of a 7-2 judicial majority, which could and eventually would become razor thin. And I want to point out here that for historical purposes, this is published in 2020. Roe was overturned by Republicans on the Supreme Court correctly in 2022. More on that later. Now, Roe could be defended only by loading the Supreme Court with pro-abortion loyalists and bullying Americans into deferring to their power as if it were legislative. Page 57 at the top. Nationally, politicians began to sort themselves into a camp that favored abortion rights and a camp that opposed them. In diametric contradiction to what would have expected in 1960, the Democrats became pro-abortion, the Republicans the anti-abortion party. This reversal was a function of a new constitutional, this reversal was a function of the new constitutional possibilities in the Civil Rights Act. The Democrats were the party of new court-mandated rights of all kinds. The habit spread to both parties, to Democrats earlier than to Republicans, of promoting judges not for their impartiality, but for their political reliability, including on the Federal Appeals Court, which are the farm system of the Supreme Court. From time to time throughout American history, the Supreme Court had been threatened by those who would use it as a weapon of partisan politics. Overreaching decisions in the 1850s, court packing in the 1930s, those pressures had been episodic. The pressure the court faced after Roe was not. Within a decade and a half, this small-looking problem would begin to erode the constitutional legitimacy of the Supreme Court itself, and the problem would turn critical in the following century. The next subsection is called Our Bodies, Ourselves. Feminism was potentially a rich intellectual current. It is close to that part of Western philosophy that, since Rousseau has speculated on what is natural to humans and what has been conferred or imposed on them by civilization. The first wave feminism of the 19th century was built on the Bible and the 14th Amendment. The second wave feminism was a moral work in progress. Happily, it had no respect for superstition. Caldwell, are you saying something about the Bible there, bud? Are you saying something? What do you mean by superstition? Less happily, it cast as superstition any tradition that could not justify itself in one sentence. Very little that passed for sexual common sense in the middle of the 20th century would be left standing by the end of it. The extraordinary phone book sized health manual, Our Bodies, Ourselves, page 58 at the top now, was first mimeographed in Boston 1969 by a collective of so-called white, I'm adding so-called, college-educated feminists in what would have been called their childbearing years. It was published commercially in 1971. Our Bodies, Ourselves was a scientific self-help book, but there was an urgent ideological argument behind it. Women had become, quote, alienated from their own bodies, unquote, the authors argued. And they must have been largely right because almost immediately on its publication, Our Bodies, Ourselves became a trusted reference work. By the 20th, by the 21st century, it had sold 4 million copies in 30 languages. The argument of the Boston Women's Health Book Collective was that doctors, the gynecological profession included, had been putting forward a mythological account of female sexuality that served society's moral needs more than women's medical ones. Consider venereal disease. Our culture, the authors wrote, has needed the fear of VD to limit sexual activity outside of marriage, especially the promiscuity of young people and women. With the advent of widespread birth control, which eliminated the fear of pregnancy, fear of VD became the last effective deterrent against complete sexual license. The editors put skeptical quotations around terms like promiscuity and sexual license because they did not believe there was any such thing. Those were parts of a moralizing view of sexuality that was rejected, that they rejected. Where doctors had withheld facts, Our Bodies, Ourselves would provide them. A woman worried about contracting venereal disease could use, for instance, the short arm inspection. This technique known by, okay, this is a direct quote, sorry. The woman worried about contracting venereal disease, Caldwell says, for instance, and then here's a block quote from Our Bodies, Ourselves. Here's the start of the quote. Quote, the short arm inspection. This technique, known by prostitutes and in the military, involves examining the penis before it becomes erect. You pull back the foreskin if he is uncircumcised, then squeeze the penis as in masturbation. A drop or two of liquid indicates the presence of an infection, unquote. That's the end of the quote. Black, Caldwell says, no one had ever talked to women that way before. Some version of the information, of course, could be found in urologists' handbooks, but to address it directly to women and in such a pragmatic spirit as if they had something to learn from prostitutes was unheard of. Page 59 at the top. Yeah, yeah. He's right. He's totally right. This is political phenomenology par excellence, bro. Caldwell continues. The editors had made a radical assessment. The male-dominated medical profession was so biased, so lacking in empathy, that a woman was safer seeking medical advice from her uncredentialed peers. This was the ethic the internet would be built on a quarter century later. When it came to abortion, which at the time of the 1971 edition was illegal in most states, the book described procedures, timing, and prices. $80 in Seattle if you were closer than 10 weeks to your last period, but 250 in private facilities in California. The authors went into such detail, even about such quack methods as infective catheterization, the high douche, and pumping air into the uterus, because they were writing for women who might resort to an illegal abortion, an event that the book described with a kind of tragic poetry. Quote, here's a quote from Our Bodies Ourselves. When legal resources fail her and she cannot get to New York, the woman with an unwanted pregnancy starts asking friends of nurses, friends of friends, nurses, taxi drivers, and a frightened and hysterical nosing around, which ends her up on a doctor's table if she's lucky, in the hands of some semi-medical quack if she's less lucky, at the mercy of her own mutilating hands if she's desperate, and in the emergency ward of a hospital if serious complications develop, unquote. The book showed everything, Caldwell continues. There was no such thing as too much information. Since women often went into labor unsure of what delivering a baby would involve, there was a series of close-in photos of babies crowning during birth, of the placenta emerging, and finally of the umbilical cord hanging free on a mass of afterbirth. It dealt with lesbianism, anal intercourse, and rape. If you're grabbing from the front, this is a quote, okay, page 59 at the bottom, a quote from Our Bodies Ourselves, courtesy of Christopher Caldwell's argument here. Quote, if you're grabbing from the front, the most effective response is a fast and hard knee to the attacker's groin. Sorry, if you're grabbed from the front, the most effective response is a fast and hard knee to the attacker's groin. So I guess there was some karate in there too. It was, in short, a book of demystification and martial arts, apparently. There was a moralism behind Our Bodies Ourselves. Sex was, upon page 60 at the top, potentially a source of boundless pleasure for people, but crabby and envious older people, representatives of the old society, were conspiring to hide the truth about it. Those old crabs had to be fought and their mythologies discredited. The chapter on abortion came before the chapter on childbearing, as if the former were the norm and the latter the exception. Having children was an aspect of the quest for sexual pleasure rather than the other way around. Skeptical about the material higher ends that had traditionally been ascribed to sex, the book was guileless and gullible about the hedonistic higher ends it proposed to replace them with. Isn't this wonderful prose? Thank you, Chris Caldwell. We'd like to thank Chris Caldwell for writing this. We'd like to thank Simon and Schuster for making this material available. Go out and get your copy today, The Age of Entitlement, America Since the 60s. We're continuing. Get a physical copy. Take notes with pencil. There is a limit to how hard one can strain against a mythology. Sexuality, the font of human life, is fickle, mysterious, contingent. It is not always subject to will, to put it mildly, and sometimes seems to blow and like the weather. A mythology that moralizes sex may do something to shelter a delicate flame. It is hard to say exactly what, but there must be a reason that flourishing, fertile, creative societies tend to be conservative about sex. The modern impulse to rationalize human relations undermined conservatism and threatened to take the ground rules of sexual relations down with it. As early as the 1920s, the English philosopher Bertrand Russell had warned that the establishment of welfare states risked turning not just the economy, but everything upside down, because the state would replace the father as protector and provider. Breaking the traditional family structure might look rational, modern, and sensible. Nonetheless, Russell wrote, here's a block quote. And where is he writing this? Let me, sorry, there's no footnote. I just realized there's no daggum footnote. What the hell's wrong with you? Why is there no footnote here? Hey, Caldwell, what the hell? What the hell, bud? What if I want to know where that is? Hold on a sec. Hold on. Am I missing it? Page 60. Maybe he has it in here. Let me look. Hmm. Bertrand Russell, Marriage and Morals. All right. Well, he doesn't have the little number, but he does have a note in the back. So a tag to that page and the quotation. All right, Caldwell, you're off the hook. I don't know who, maybe that was somebody at Simon and Schuster that did that. The editor. What do you have against footnotes exactly? I don't understand that, Simon and Schuster. You really think that the people reading this are going to go, you know what? I see a little number there in the trash. Who are you writing to? Okay, here's the quotation from Russell, bottom page 60. If this should occur, we must expect a complete breakdown of traditional morality, since there will no longer be any reason why a mother should wish the paternity of her child to be indubitable. Whether the effect upon men would be good or bad, I do not venture to say. It would eliminate from their lives the only emotion equal in importance to sex, love. It would make sex love itself more trivial. It would make it far more difficult to take an interest in anything after one's death. It would make men less active and probably cause them to retire earlier from work. It would diminish their interest in history and their sense of the continuity of historical tradition. Page 61 at the top, unquote. Caldwell continues here. Here, Russell, enthusiast for sexual freedom that he was, because he's an atheist, was willing to go out on a limb. Citing the ebb of paternal feeling in the Roman Empire and among upper classes in his own time, he warned that an unsuperstitious attitude toward family formation would ultimately threaten Western countries with desexualization. Here's a block quote again. My belief, quote, my belief, though I put it forward with some hesitation, that the elimination of paternity as a recognized social relation would tend to make men's emotional life trivial and thin, causing in the end a slowly growing boredom and despair in which procreation would gradually die out, leaving the human race to be replenished by stocks that had preserved the older convention, unquote. Where's that from? Let me look. Looking in the notes, page 60, my belief. 61, page 61. Okay, same one, marriage and morals. Okay, Caldwell continues, the idea that desexualization might be the result of scientific modernization seemed ridiculous in the flapper era when Russell was writing, and even when Our Bodies Ourselves was first published. The mass media was full of evidence that women were as sexual as they had ever been. In the late spring of 1962, the Saturday Evening Post had asked women what they thought the ideal age for marriage was. Their answers clustered around age 21, though a fifth believed in marrying younger. What is striking is that 99% of women listed age 27 or lower. There's no record in the responses of anyone suggesting a woman might not want to marry. Russell was right. You can call sexual morality a mythology constructed by life-hating prudes, but they too serve an erotic function. Without an external source of sexual morality, excuse me, people would behave in a civilized people who would behave in a civilized way must produce their own prudery and carry it around inside them. Hmm, that's very interesting. I don't think I marked that, and I don't know why. I'm going to mark it now. I'm going to reread that. Russell was right. Now, remember, he's writing 100 years ago or more. So it took a while for him to be shown to be right by someone like Caldwell, where it was believable. Russell was right. You can call sexual morality a mythology constructed by life-hating prudes, but they too serve an erotic function. Without an external source of sexual morality. Now listen to this. Without an external source of sexual morality, that is the culture external to you, imposing it upon you, reinvigorating your own internal sense. Without an external source of sexual morality, like from the Bible, people who would behave in a civilized way must produce their own prudery and carry it around inside them. He must demasculinize. She must defeminize. As Ray Davies of the Kinks wrote in The Good Life, his 1970 song about the absurd glut of sensual gratifications offered to a rock star, I got so many women that I wish I wasn't a man. It was a disturbing thought. Hypersexualization might be a mask worn by desexualization. What is thrilling, fulfilling, and functional about sexuality might be wrapped up in the very complexes about sexuality that crusaders for sexual freedom and other reformers insisted on getting rid of. Okay, now we got to talk about the Equal Rights Amendment, which we discussed on the podcast with Carol Felsenthal, the biographer of the late Phyllis Schlafly. And Phyllis Schlafly was the most famous opponent of the Equal Rights Amendment. Page 62. No ideology or belief system existing at the time of the 1960s counterculture would have allowed people to predict which facets of pre-counterculture sexual morality would flourish over the coming decades and which would die. One might have thought that prostitution would be validated on grounds of freedom of choice and entrepreneurship, and pornography scorned on the grounds of inauthenticity. That is how things were trending. In the winter of 1976, a convention of the American Bar Association came within 2 votes of endorsing the legalization of prostitution, while pornography was confined to disreputable red light districts. It is a measure of how rare dirty movies were in 1978 that X-rated video cassettes sold in men's magazines for about $100 a piece. But customs took a different turn. After some experimentation in the late 1970s, when the state of Nevada began licensing bordellos, the reputation of prostitution would suffer in ways it had not since the 19th century, when newspapers sensationalized it as the white slave trade. I would say the so-called white. The equivalent 21st century expression would be human trafficking. Meanwhile, pornography would, via the internet, find its way to the very heart of the nation's economic life and the world's. Martin Amis's Yellow Dog, 2003, was one of the first novels to include a character, the pornography-addled tabloid journalist Clint Smoker, whose quest for the imagined glory online winds up removing him from life altogether. Quote, he knew that the distance between himself and the world of women was getting greater. Each night, as he entered the Borgesian metropolis of electronic pornography, with its infinities, its immoralities, its immortalities, Clint was, in a sense, traveling toward women, but he was also traveling away from them, unquote. Page 63 at the top. By 2015, 45% of the men in Harvard's graduating class would be watching pornography multiple times a week. Yeah, that's not surprising. The objectification of women, the grievance that had once seemed the primum mobile of all feminism, endured. Indeed, as the 1970s wore on, ads began to portray them as sex machines. Quote, for those nights you want everything to be just right, unquote, ran a 1974 magazine spread for electrophonic stereos. Electrophonic stereos, okay. The illustration showed a woman standing on a white shag rug behind various space-age stereo equipment, her head arched back in ecstasy as she is embraced from behind. Quote, you'll let him know, too, that you're involved in the today sound, unquote. When a shampoo called Gee, your hair smells terrific, elicited the eponymous, I can't read this morning, I don't know why. Maybe I haven't had enough coffee. Eponymous compliment, a young woman's thought bubble read, jackpot. The Mistress collection by Funky Fashions advertised sophisticated women to own at least one pair of strategically cut out bikini panties. Women were being sold a sexuality more suited to adolescent males. Again, we're interacting with and discussing The Age of Entitlement, America since the 60s by Christopher Caldwell, Simon and Schuster, 2020. Go out and get your copy today. It's blurbed by such notables as Victor Davis Hanson, author of Case for Trump. In this landmark cultural and political history of the last century, Christopher Caldwell brilliantly dissects the new progressive establishment and shows how the reforms of the 60s gradually devolved into intolerance, self-righteousness, and the antithesis of what has started out as naive idealism. A singular analysis by a masterful chronicler of the 60s dreams that have gone so terribly but predictably wrong. I agree. That's Victor Davis Hanson talking about this book. And I call it political phenomenology par excellence. He calls it a landmark cultural and political history. It's definitely American political phenomenology, and very well done. Caldwell, his stock and trade is finding the anecdote. He usually uses three anecdotes in a paragraph when he makes a point. Um, it's 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 a it's hard to do political phenomenology well, and I think his usage of um, empirical data, like polling, for example, interspersed with the qualitative data of the anecdote, make his presentation enjoyable to read and informative for those who have an attention span and who are curious. It's not just that he has anecdotes, it's what he notices about the anecdotes that elucidates and fits in with the quantitative data that he shares. Okay? He's also a master of the history, so that when he gives an anecdote, it's not a wacky comment, it's insightful. And it's very difficult to be insightful while avoiding wackiness because you can't be wacky and insightful at the same time. What I mean by wacky is you say something that's just at odds with something more obvious and hard to explain away. Americans wanted freedom from sexual rules, but they wouldn't be really free until they could be assured that no one would turn up his nose as if the old rules still obtained. That required imposing other kinds of rules. The title Miss, a substitute for Miss, MISS, and MERS, Misters, which we usually say Mrs., that implied nothing about marital status, was introduced into the national conversation when Gloria Steinem founded Miss Magazine in 1971, MS. Its ultimate source was a Marxist publication, News and Letters, which addressed its subscriptions that way. Steinem had heard it mentioned by a civil rights worker in 1979 radio broadcast on New York's WBAI. There was never much affirmative enthusiasm for Miss, even among feminists. In the spring of 1974, 14% of women and 12% of men said they liked the title. By the end of the decade, only 16% of women and 15% of men had taken it up. But the spread of Miss was a lot like other things after the 1960s. The lack of enthusiasm for it among the general public seemed to matter little. Page 64 at the top. There was a moral certitude behind it, a missionary authority that could impose itself even in the face of resistance, though it was hard to tell where that authority came from. Over time, Miss it was. The biggest ambition to alter the U.S. Constitution itself, a the biggest ambition was to alter, let me get the verb in that sentence, geez. The biggest ambition was to alter the U.S. Constitution itself. A proposed Equal Rights Amendment held quite simply that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Between 1972 and 1977, it was ratified by 35 of the 38 states necessary to amend the Constitution. Americans backed the ERA in polls, but their support was impressionistic and vague, broad but not deep. When state legislatures dragged their feet and 5 of them even rescinded their approval, no one particularly seemed to care. By the way, Phyllis Schlafly was behind a lot of that, and we covered that on the podcast. When state legislatures dragged their feet and 5 of them rescinded their approval, no one particularly seemed to care. Despite a constitutionally dubious congressional extension of the term for ratification from March 1979 to March 1982, the measure died. The sudden collapse of support for the ERA shocked activists. Well, which kind of activists? Phyllis Schlafly was an activist. She was very happy. Since the civil rights era, old understandings of the Constitution had seemed so antiquated and feeble that anyone speaking in the name of reform could knock them over with a breath. Now it appeared Americans didn't want the Constitution tinkered with. They had found ways to resist. The ERA promised to feminize public space, just as Civil Rights Act had promised to desegregate it. People didn't want that. As early as the spring of 1975, among those who blocked its passage, the reason most often cited was that the equal rights for women could eventually end up destroying the institution of marriage and family life. By the end of the decade, a majority of Americans had come to fear that once women were given equal rights, employers will have to hire admitted homosexuals. 19% even believed that separate public toilets for men and women will not be allowed, though 3/4 of the country dismissed that idea as fanciful. In 1978, as Republican candidates were heading for big gains in midterm elections, women looked quite conservative in their views. The Roper organization polled adults nationwide to ask whom they would vote for as Woman of the Year. Anita Bryant led the field with 19%. Bryant had been Miss Oklahoma in 1958, a popular singer, Paper Roses in 1960, and a spokeswoman for the Florida citrus industry. What she was doing then, though, was leading a campaign called Save Our Children, aimed at reversing a Miami area ordinance barring discrimination against gays. I think he means homosexuals because uh, there's a lot of really happy people, and I don't think that they're discriminated against. No other woman came close to her popularity. Only the president's wife, Rosalind Carter, was at 13%, and the newscaster Barbara Walters, who was at 10%, made it into the double digits. The same month, the Washington Post found that only 39% of Americans believed our society discriminates against women. Nonetheless, 58% favored giving them more rights. That was a common pattern with feminism, which looked in the light of certain polls like a solution in search of a problem. We got one paragraph left in this wonderful political phenomenology of the American politics. The Age of Entitlement, America Since the 60s by Christopher Caldwell. Simon and Schuster, go out and get your copy today. And get a pencil. Follow along, write notes with your hand. No ads. Be disciplined. Don't be an idiot. President Richard Nixon, though an ambitious program through, speaking of idiot, through, not though, through an ambitious program of internal polling, had already made a discovery of more general application. Americans were happy to run their mouths about all kinds of experimentation, but they did not much like it up close. In this political sense, women's lib was very much like civil rights. Whenever you personalize the issue rather than speaking in lofty abstractions, people got suspicious. Whatever pieties they might spout about helping the unfortunate, 2/3 of Americans were outraged that women getting welfare money are having illegitimate babies to increase the money they get. And although they said they liked the ERA, they had little respect for the people who were bringing it about. By the spring of 1977, Americans agreed 42%, as much as disagreed 42%, with the hard proposition that advocates of the Equal Rights Amendment are mainly women's libers, who would totally change the traditional role of women, and that is wrong. 42% to 42% divided over that statement. They had come to identify the Constitution changers as a class, a new elite that had been formed in the crucible of protest against the Vietnam War. Okay, so we got now the elite versus the not elite. And that is a subject that comes up again and again. They had come to identify the Constitution changers as a class, a new elite that had been formed in the crucible of protest against the Vietnam War. Page 65 at the bottom. I first read this in the backyard Sunday, 18 June 2022, years after Jesus, at 8:40 p.m. I probably had the fountains going. I was probably battling rats with my BB gun, and I probably had a cigar with some bourbon or Writer's Tears, Irish whiskey, or something like that. Thanks for joining me on the Republican Professor podcast. I've been your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. We've been interacting with this wonderful writer named Christopher Caldwell, and we've just finished doing a transformative reading, a fair use of transformative reading of his chapter 3 called Sex. The next chapter is chapter 4 called War. And here are the subtitles coming up. The Vietnam War as an establishment undertaking. America's weak rear. The Vietnam War generation and class. The counterculture. Sources of baby boom power. Renaissance or decay, coming up on this series on the Age of Entitlement, America Since the 60s, by Christopher Caldwell, Simon & Schuster, 2020. And I'm hoping that you're paying attention to what I'm saying as far as taking notes, getting a pencil, writing notes, check mark, write dates that you've finished it. Like it helps you keep track of your intellectual development, and whether you agree with it or not. I mean, you're interacting with something that is shaping how you see the world, and it's very important that you get this right. This is very important stuff, and Christopher Caldwell's a good guide. This is a wilderness. You need a good guide, otherwise you're going to get lost. It's far too vast. Okay. This is Tuesday, 24 March, 2026 years after Jesus. Like I said, it is a Tuesday. I've enjoyed this time with you. We'll see you next time. Take care, guys. God bless.